Well, I teach two courses that are LGBT related. Introduction to Queer Cinema is the first course. And in this course, it's basically a study of canonical films, both sort of mainstream films and experimental films. And the periodization actually starts with, at the very beginning of cinema, an 1895 film by William Dirksen, who was working in the Edison labs with early sort of sound experimentation. Vito Russo, who wrote the classic book on gay cinema called The Celluloid Closet, calls it the Gay Brothers. But it's an example of how the course tries to complicate these films, bringing in contemporary theory and also locating films within a historical, social, political production history. So this film actually is a film that shows two men dancing while Dirksen himself is playing the violin. And the two men are actually two sailors on a ship where there would be no women, and the song is called The Song of the Cabin Boy. So there's a way that it actually captures a history of same-sex environments, spaces during the late 19th century, early 20th century, where men felt like they could be more intimate in those spaces. And so to call this the Gay Brothers doesn't quite capture a kind of history that they themselves would not identify as gay, probably identified as heterosexual, but in these spaces, they would have felt like it was easier to be, as I say, intimate in dancing, in sports and sort of other events. So it's an example of taking sort of contemporary theory, as I say, and looking at a lot of the classical texts, but trying to problematize them and not allow a kind of presentist reading to basically monolithically position these films. So the course starts there and runs through, as I say, a number of canonical texts to do this kind of reading that's both historical and also theoretical. Some of the films that we look at are Queen Christina with Greta Garbo, Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, Some Like It Hot, directed by Billy Wilder, The Boys in the Band, directed by William Friedkin, Desert Hearts, which is a lesbian romantic film, independent film in the mid-1980s, into what's called the New Queer Cinema, where a number of directors, Gus Van Sant and Gregg, Tom Kalin, were making films such as My Own Private Idaho, Swoon, and even other films like Poison come out of what's considered to be a new queer energy that's challenging mainstream cinema and trying to come up with films that are sort of coming from within gay community and gay subjectivity instead of industry films, which have been sort of exampled by Queen Christina, Rope, and Boys in the Band. And then the course ends with more contemporary films like Brokeback Mountain, The Kids Are All Right, and Pariah, a very recent film. But mixed in within these feature films, we put what's being produced with larger budgets through a lens of telling a story, narrative, against an experimental film, which is often made by queer artists who are talking about, their own sort of response to being gay or lesbian, and how this is either accepted or demonized within the public sphere, the dominant public sphere. So you get filmmakers like Kenneth Anger, Jack Smith, Andy Warhol, Barbara Rubin, and others who are making shorter experimental films that suggest an alternative cinema to this more mainstream cinema. So this is the films that we look at and the way that we approach these films in Intro to Queer Cinema. The other course that I teach is post-war queer avant-garde cinema, which mainly focuses on experimental film. And it looks at experimental film from 1945 to 1968 and raises the issue that a number of the classical experimental films, influential films made during this time period, were made by gay men. And you have filmmakers like, and I mentioned those with the Intro to Queer Cinema course, but like Kenneth Anger, Jack Smith, Andy Warhol, but there are many, many others. Willard Moss, Gregory Markopoulos, Curtis Harrington, Charles Bolton House, Jose Rodriguez Sotero, and then a number of actors in the cinema, Mario Montez and Taylor Mead, that there's a sense that a major part of experimental cinema in the US is coming out of queer community, queer subculture, and to think about what that means that these queer artists found this space to basically be creative and to find the means of production, however cheap that was, but also spaces to exhibit this work, to be part of a conversation that in a way is a conversation that develops, that turns into a conversation that later cinema will pick up, that even Hollywood itself will end up appropriating after this period. When you look at films like Midnight Cowboy, in the late 1960s, and other films in the 70s and 80s, they're being influenced by both what's being produced aesthetically, but also the approach to queer subjectivity in this earlier cinema. So this is a course that is basically focused on, as I'm calling it, this queer avant-garde during this period. It starts in 45 because that is the end of the war, and that's when a number of these young filmmakers start to make the films, and ends in 1968. And I use 1968 because this is the moment when Andy Warhol is shot by a radical lesbian feminist who wrote a manifesto called Scum. And Jack Smith basically stops making experimental films and moves into experimental theater. And Kenneth Anger also is basically at the end of his very creative realm. So to think about why 1968 becomes this kind of key year when this queer energy shuts down, interestingly, a year before Stonewall and the rise of kind of a new gay and lesbian energy that arises at this time period. Well, I also teach in film studies. My position is in film studies, American studies, and LGBT studies. So I do teach courses that are basically a close analysis of film aesthetics. So I teach the Introduction to Film Studies course, for instance. And one of the pleasures I get is, studying a film, how it's put together, how meaning is constructed through every choice that a filmmaker makes. And that can be, again, costume, sets, color, where the camera is located, whether it's a close-up or an extreme long shot, why these choices are being made and how that changes the meaning. And I basically bring that into the Introduction to Queer Cinema and the Post-War Queer Avant-Garde Cinema course. So within those courses that I'm teaching for LGBT studies, I'm also teaching a sense of close analysis and thinking about how these elements of aesthetics or narrative construction actually can construct a queer aesthetic, what you can do differently in the choices that you make that seem to be speaking from maybe a sort of queer interiority or a queer experience of the world. So I think that actually there's a nice parallel between what I'm teaching in Intro to Film with the queer studies courses. I'm also, along with the duties of programming, being on the LGBT Studies Committee, I chair a committee that is actually given a small amount of money to build up the collection of films, DVDs, and other media-related material for the Film Studies Center and for also the library at large. And so lately, because of the amount of money that I've been given to do this, that this committee has been given to do this, we have found that we can buy all the DVDs that we want, and there's still money left over. So we've been actually building up the film collection, the 35 millimeter and 16 millimeter film collection at the Film Studies Center, building up the archive of LGBT material that can be used in the classroom and also for film series. And just this year, for instance, we bought a 35 millimeter print of Pedro Almodovar's Matador. We were given a 35 millimeter print of the recent film Pariah with help from an alum, Lisa Cortez. We've been building up the 16 millimeter collection of the canon, including The Children's Hour, a 1961 film, a 1965 film adaptation of Mary McCarthy's The Group, some television dramas really important from the 1970s, again on 16 millimeter, A Question of Love with Gina Rowlands and Jane Alexander, a really important made-for-television movie, which actually is not available on video, so it's a very rare copy, what we've been able to purchase. And a 16 millimeter copy of Rope, and other films. So we are in a really wonderful position at Yale in having this support for, again, building this material for both present but also future scholarship for both undergraduates and graduate students.